Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, I've got with me George Beebe, the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute and a former director of the CIA's Russia Analysis, as well as director of the CIA's Open Source Center and former staff advisor on Russia Matters for Vice President Cheney. George, welcome.
Thank you very much.
George, we met actually recently at a conference and you were speaking there as well. And with your background, especially working for the open source desk at the CIA within the kind of the intelligence arm, not the operations arm of the organization, I kind of wanted to know a little bit how you assess the role of the intelligence services today in the US and within its foreign policy. How important do you think is the role of the CIA in what US foreign policy is?
Well, I can talk a little bit about what I think it should be, and also talk about what I think it is. In general, I think intelligence is extremely important for American foreign policy. We need to understand the world. We need to understand the dynamics that are at work in the international system. We need to understand the capabilities and intentions of other actors. That includes allies and partners, as well as adversaries and enemies. The better informed, the better we understand those developments and dynamics, the more effectively American policymakers can adopt policies that protect American security, that advance Americans' prosperity. And that's not an easy thing to do.
No.
Understanding what's going on in the world is a huge challenge because you have to get out of the American mindset. You have to see the world through other eyes that are foreign eyes. These are the perspectives that other countries have, how they perceive the United States, how they perceive developments in the world. And you have to do that in such a way that doesn't justify them, that doesn't say, oh, here's how they see things and they're right. It has to be an understanding that allows you to anticipate what they might do, how they might react to what the United States is doing. Um, you need to account for misperceptions and misunderstandings, which frequently play an enormous role in international crises and conflicts. But that kind of understanding not only helps US policymakers prepare to defend against threats, but it also enables and empowers American diplomats so that they can be most effective in dealing with their counterparts abroad. Now, that's sort of the ideal, what you would hope for from intelligence. But there are other aspects of intelligence that are also part of what an intelligence organization does. When the United States created the Central Intelligence Agency, this was in 1947, in the National Security Act of 1947. And this was a reaction to what happened in World War II, particularly Pearl Harbor. Um, that that surprise attack was something that had a lasting effect on the American psyche, on the American body politic. And one of the things that legislators wanted to ensure was that we wouldn't be taken by surprise like that again. So they wanted a central intelligence organization that had access to all different types of information and could be a central point where all this was assembled and analyzed. And the hope was that this would minimize the likelihood of future surprises. But what else happened at that time? We were entering into a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And there was another aspect of World War II that had an impact on how the CIA was designed and organized. And that was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, a part of the US military during World War II that engaged in secret paramilitary operations. The covert activities. And the CIA ended up becoming an organization that embraced both that operational paramilitary capability and the analytic capability. And those two things existed in a sort of uneasy tension and always have ever since that time. Because if you're an arm of American policy, if you're out there doing things in the world, not just gathering and analyzing information, but attempting to neutralize bad guys overseas, undertake covert operations that sometimes might involve overthrowing other organizations or sabotaging different infrastructure elements abroad. It compromises your ability as an organization to see things through the eyes of the other side, to be as analytically objective as you can be, free from concerns about policy. And the tension in a nutshell is if you're out there trying to make a policy succeed, you have a vested interest in how your intelligence analysis describes the prospect for that operation and the success of that operation. Um, so that is a tension that has ebbed and flowed over the years within the U.S. intelligence community.
So in a sense, if you're if you're playing the regime in the regime change business, then obviously it will impact the way that you do the regime analysis business.
Exactly right. And I'll give you a very recent example of this. The Israelis and their Israeli intelligence service came to the White House, and this was all described in the New York Times account of why President Trump ultimately decided to launch this conflict against Iran that we're now trying to wrap up. But they essentially said, hey, look, here's what we can do. Here's the intelligence that we have about Iran. And here's what we propose to do to eliminate the Iranian nuclear weapons capability, to neutralize or eliminate its missile capability, to overthrow this regime essentially and inspire some sort of uprising popularly in Iran. And they were quite optimistic. That intelligence analysis was very much skewed to influence President Trump to think, oh, yeah, we've got a great opportunity. This can work. Right. Now, in retrospect, that intelligence analysis was badly distorted. It badly overestimated the likelihood that these attacks would produce some sort of popular uprising that would overthrow the theocracy in Iran. And it illustrates to me the tension between policy advocacy and the Israelis and Benjamin Netanyahu, while they were in the White House, were absolutely advocating a policy. And they were using intelligence for the purposes of that advocacy, which almost inevitably compromises the objectivity of the judgments that you produce.
Hey, just a very quick note. The best way to support this channel is by signing up for my free Substack. You can also help with a paid subscription there, or you can get some of our new merch on neutralitystudies.com. Links below. See you there. So this leads me to the question, how deep is the intermingling and interaction between different intelligence services, foreign intelligence services, especially the MI6 and Mossad? Because the problem we have is that these entities are basically, you cannot audit them. You cannot, the CIA can actually refuse to answer questions from your lawmakers, from Congress. They are on record saying, like, I cannot answer this because national security. So you cannot actually look, they're like a black box within the black box of governance. And how much do you know about how they interact with other intelligence services? Because my assumption would be that they have shared interests, maybe for different reasons, but they do have shared interests. Do they cooperate among each other in order to get a political outcome that they want to see?
Well, I'll say a couple of things in response. One is the CIA can't actually refuse to answer questions from Congress. They can refuse in certain settings. If there is an open public hearing or asked about information which is classified, then of course they will have to say, I'll have to answer that in a closed hearing.
Okay.
Now, there are also certain programs, certain bits of intelligence that are so highly classified that they're only shared with specific named individuals in Congress. And so there are provisions for that kind of sharing when something is so sensitive that you can't share it with the entire roster of Congress and their staffs. You have to do so under carefully controlled conditions with a few specially named congressional leaders. But there is not an instance that I'm aware of where CIA can simply say, sorry, we're not going to answer that question at all. That would be a big problem. And
Okay, okay.
there you've got the question more broadly of how does a democratic government actually maintain democratic control over secret intelligence organizations, and that's a very important question. If you
But you would say it's not perfect, but it's given. I mean,
That's right.
the assumption that the CIA runs in the background and runs amok is overblown. It's still under democratic control.
That's right. Now, one can question the degree to which this sharing is effective, how much candor and openness and transparency is there between the intelligence community and the people in Congress that they're supposed to be reporting to. That's a different question. But to say that there's no oversight and they can simply block congressional investigation and questioning, I think is an exaggeration. Um, Now, I the question about sharing with other intelligence services, that is a part of, intelligence work. The CIA can't, be everywhere at all times and gather information everywhere at all times. It needs help, and so oftentimes you're gonna, lean on partners that have better collection capabilities than you do in certain areas. Now, uh, part of this is an inevitable advantage that being local can bring in intelligence matters. Geography matters, and culture matters, and linguistic capabilities matter, and all of that. So, ideally, what you want to do in intelligence sharing is to use partners when they have advantages, but you have to do so with your eyes open, recognizing that some of them have agendas, that they're trying to influence the United States government too. So it's something that needs to be done. It needs to be done carefully. And usually the way this works is there's a quid pro quo, meaning if a foreign intelligence organization is partnering with CIA and they want to provide information, or we want information from them, they're going to want information from us. So there's a two-way sharing that goes on. Um, but that is something that has to be done carefully with your eyes open, recognizing how susceptible you can be to the influence of these foreign organizations. And I'll cite another example, a very well known example of what is called intelligence liaison,
Mhm.
sharing of information gathered by a foreign intelligence organization that ended up not being handled with due skepticism and caution. And that was the case of the so called Iraqi defector Curveball in the run up to the invasion of Iraq under George W. Bush. This was an Iraqi national that was being handled at the time by the German intelligence service, and he provided information that, in retrospect, was clearly fabricated. But neither the German organization nor the US government adequately dealt with that. And we ended up using that to justify the claims that there were active WMD programs in Iraq that had to be addressed through the Bush administration argued anyway through invasion.
Yeah, although in that moment there was also a very clear political motivation at kind of finding anything you can in order to justify a policy that you want to do. So it was not, I mean, the whole thing of, oh, an intelligence failure, the intelligence failed, it's kind of a very, very weak defense for doing a policy that people wanted to do for completely different reasons than what
Right.
they.
I think the thing to keep in mind there was, and I was, for part of this period, I was working in CIA, and for part of it, I was in the White House on Vice President Cheney's staff as his advisor on Russia. So I wasn't dealing directly with Iraq and Middle Eastern issues, but I saw a good amount of the intelligence that was being produced at the time. I did not get the impression that the White House, knew all along that this was fabricated false information and were cynically using it to advance a political agenda. This was more a case of confirmation bias. You tend to see what you believe, rather than the other way around. So there was a belief already in the White House that the Iraqis couldn't be trusted. We had gone through this during the first Gulf War when we discovered that the Iraqis had made a lot more progress on their nuclear program than the intelligence community had assessed at the time. So there was a belief among policymakers that, we need to be biased in favor of assuming the worst, believing that there's stuff going on that we might not be aware of through intelligence channels. So that predisposition to believe this was going on
Mm.
made the assessment of this kind of information much less skeptical than it probably should have been in retrospect.
Yeah, so you had on the one hand confirmation bias, on the other hand you had people who were trying to find what then would give them reason, and we remember also some of these nonsensical political claims like Donald Rumsfeld saying like absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and really like just deep nonsensical stuff that just like basically is there to serve a political end. But they're the politicians. I mean, the politicians do what politicians do. That's fine. The
That's right.
question is on which does the intelligence then push into a certain direction, or is intelligence, as you said, in the optimal world, should be like very neutral, right? Should be just there and serve the purpose of informing the politicians. But the danger is, of course, that if there are within the intelligence political aims, that it will start influencing the
That's
politics.
right.
How far down that rabbit hole are we in your assessment?
Well, I mentioned earlier that the CIA, from its very inception, had both an analytic mission in which the effort was to be as objective and neutral and free of policy bias as you can be, and an operational element, which by its very nature has a policy goal behind it. And that tension has never been overcome, and I think it's actually gotten worse. Now, why do I say that? 9/11 happened, and the attacks on September 11th, 2001 changed CIA quite significantly. It undertook a massive hiring campaign, so it grew enormously in size. And the mission to find terrorists, to identify plots before they were able to come to fruition, and to go abroad and take the fight to these terrorist organizations so that they couldn't take the fight to the U.S. homeland was intelligence mission number one. But that, by its nature, is both an analytic function and an operational function.
Yeah.
And the paramilitary parts of CIA grew quite substantially. We hired a whole bunch of people whose mission was to find bad guys and neutralize them, either by capturing them or killing them. And when you devote such an enormous part of the organization in terms of money, hiring, and mission to that objective, you change the organization's balance. You inevitably become part of the policy making equation because you are responsible for carrying out operations that are meant to have policy impacts. So it's very hard in that kind of a situation to be free of policy views. And that almost inevitably makes that effort to balance objectivity and operational impact successfully.
What about ideology? I mean, do people in the CIA, the way you put it, believe that there's just bad guys who do bad things because they're bad people? The kind of the stereotypical Shakespeare has this beautiful character of Iago in Othello, and Iago gets up in the morning and says, "I want to do evil." Is that the mindset? Because the other thing that an intelligence agency could do is to say, like, why are there people who want to do bad things to us?
Right.
We could try to understand. And there's this famous interview with Osama bin Laden, where he's asked, "Why do you do that?" And Osama bin Laden actually explains the logical chain that lets him to do what he does. I mean, that would be the other way of approaching it. But so, is there this let's call it an American ideology of good, we the good guys versus the bad guys, and we go and kill them, and if we kill them all, then the problem's gone. Is that strong in the CIA?
Well, I think that in any kind of a large organization, you're going to have a diversity of views and a diversity of people and perspectives. So I think it would be wrong to say this is the way the CIA thinks about that issue.
Right, right.
You're going to find people that have a very sophisticated understanding of how other people in the world think, how other political cultures operate, how other governments work, and are able to put themselves in the shoes of other people effectively and understand their perceptions and the operating environments in which they're making decisions. You're also going to have people that have fairly simplistic views, and they all live in the same organization and have to work together and get along, and that shouldn't be surprising. So there are elements of very black and white views, and there are also a lot of people that have much more complex understandings of things.
Yeah, but exactly, like, it's an intelligence service that deals with such a very, very important information, right? And like national security, like deeply national security related information, and you need clearance and whatnot. Isn't the isn't the tendency strong of such an organization to create kind of a framework? And if the person doesn't fit into the framework, then they need to they need to leave, right? They cannot be part of the organization. So an ideological bias of the organization to foster a certain type of thinking, or is the CIA kind of, is it diverse enough to deal with itself?
Well, it is diverse, and there are different organizational cultures within the agency, and that's inevitable and probably a good thing. You need a different kind of mindset to be um, a what we call a case officer, someone who spends most of his career overseas, whose job it is to persuade foreign nationals to give the U.S. government information that that we want, but the host government doesn't want us to have. Uh, so you have to have a certain personality type to do that effectively. And oftentimes it's a different skill set. It's a different set of strengths than you need to be, a special operations person who's, out there doing paramilitary kinds of things.
Yeah.
That's a different mindset too. And then, your analyst, it has probably more in common with your average university professor than he does with, a paramilitary operations person. And the organization needs all of those things. And the US government needs all of those things. In order to be effective, you've got to be able to do different things with people that have different strengths.
Um, and the interesting thing about the US is, of course, that the CIA is only one out of, I think, 17 intelligence organizations, right? And at the very top of that structure sits the director of national intelligence, which until like a few days ago was Tulsi Gabbard.
Right.
She, on her way out, really slammed the door with revelations on these biolabs all over the world. Like, what did you make out of that? And what is the role of the CIA within the 17 organization? I mean, I suppose the CIA is the biggest of the 17, right?
Well, I don't actually know the answer to that, and I think it's probably classified. So even if I did know the answer, I probably wouldn't be able to say so publicly. But um, the CIA is a large organization. Its role has changed since 2004. Um, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of 9/11 on CIA itself was quite significant, but it also resulted in a reorganization of the intelligence community as a whole, and it changed the CIA's role. It used to be that the director of CIA was actually called the director of Central Intelligence, and
Mhm.
he had dual responsibilities for running CIA itself as an organization, but also overseeing the coordination of the rest of the intelligence community. And the Intelligence Reorganization Act of 2004 said, we're not going to have the CIA work that way anymore.
Mm.
The director of Central Intelligence will become the director of the CIA only, and there will be this new office of the Director of National Intelligence with the Director of National Intelligence at its head that would have that integrative responsibility for overseeing all of these different intelligence organizations and ensuring that they're working together harmoniously and sharing information that wasn't happening. And part of the reason for this was that information that led to the 9/11 attacks was not shared as well as it should have been between the FBI and the CIA. So lawmakers decided to try to fix that problem by creating the DNI. And a lot of the responsibilities that were in uh, the uh, the CIA previously got moved out. Now, how successful has that been? I think not very successful, quite honestly. I think what we ended up doing was simply creating another layer of bureaucratic organization that brought with it a fair amount of bureaucratic bloat and not a whole lot of real authority over the intelligence community, and very mixed success in promoting the kinds of sharing that that reorganization was meant to facilitate. So I think we're in a situation right now where the office of the DNI needs some fairly significant revamping and reorganization and reform. And I think part of what Tulsi was doing was trying to hasten that, but that's going to be an effort that will take a long time and has to be done by several different administrations.
One of the things that, Tulsi Gabbard, but also the, parts of the Trump administration, what they've been working partially towards is a little bit of more possibility for auditing or transparency. So, I mean, her basically unveiling the biolabs that were going on, which is something that her and others in the administration really bothered, because I think she's actually scared and of the potential like destruction that pathogens can create, right, that you work with. So, and she then obviously she didn't try to crack down internally. She now tried to expose that and create public awareness of it. Do you think that that is something that the United States must do more? The ability for whistleblowers also to expose certain things, because we are like, I mean, again, this double-edged sword, right? National security on the one hand, but horrible overreach potentially on the other. How would you square that circle?
Well, I think when I first joined the CIA and throughout the vast bulk of my career there, the question of whether someone was a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, never arose. I had no idea what the political leanings of my colleagues were. Never came up, and it certainly didn't affect our analytic judgments on things. So, I think we're in a situation right now where that has changed. I think the intelligence community has been infected with political partisanship. And it's not surprising that it has been for two reasons. One is partisanship in the country as a whole has grown, much, much more acute. We're living in the United States right now in a very divided, very partisan, very acrimonious political environment. Almost everything gets infected with politics. Your family Thanksgiving dinners get infected with this. So it would be surprising indeed if that didn't bleed over into the intelligence community of the United States as well. Um, and that's also true in academia in the United States. I think if you look at studies of political leanings in colleges and universities and their faculties in the country, uh, it has been skewed, I think, quite severely toward the left. The number of professors that identify as conservatives or Republicans in U.S. Universities is plummeted. It's a different situation. I think universities leaned left when I was in school years ago, but now it's very rare indeed to find professors who openly acknowledge being conservative or Republican. And that, of course, has an impact on CIA because it does a lot of recruiting from these universities. That's the population it draws upon in its hiring. So that's part of the issue here too. But I think there were clearly abuses that took place in the so-called RussiaGate episode. There were things that were done that shouldn't have been done. And those had enormous consequences for American foreign policy, for our relationship with Russia. I think they played a significant role in contributing to problems in US-Russian relations that in turn are now, you know, quite dangerous. We're in this war in Ukraine that could easily escalate into direct conflict between the United States and Russia. And RussiaGate, I think, was a factor, not the only one, but certainly a factor that contributed to the situation we're in right now. And I think what Tulsi has done is say, hey, look, let's publish some of what happened there with the goal to make sure we don't get into that kind of situation again. Now, the difficulty in doing this is um, how you expose this matters a lot because it can be perceived as an act of partisanship in and of itself.
Hmm.
So, how do you reform and insulate the intelligence community from what I would call, partisan malfeasance without exacerbating that partisanship or undermining the argument that her office is being politically neutral in all of this, and that's not an easy question to answer. I can't give you a pat formula on all of this, but one of the things I would say is we need some understandings, within our government about the rules, the do's and don'ts. What are we going to do? What principles will govern things? And the more explicit those are, the more you've got methodologies, the more you've got agreed approaches, the freer you will be from the influence of partisanship. So, my instinct on this is to say, we've got ourselves a problem. It needs to be addressed. And the way to do it, I think, is through articulating very clear methods and rules and procedures that will apply uniformly. And in so doing, minimize the likelihood that these sorts of things will be driven by partisan objectives.
Yeah, again, the optimal dream, then of course having a neutral organization that's just there for the purpose of serving the state, right? That's what it should be, and the question whether it is a huge one. But let's put that as maybe a little bit aside, and for the final 10, 15 minutes, concentrate on another other one of your specialties, which is of course Russia, having been on the Russia desk and so on. How do you evaluate the role of the United States at the moment in this entire, what to me looks like an escalation that's going on with the drones launched from Ukraine or not, but definitely produced also partially outside of Ukraine in European countries, now being launched deep into Russia. And we've seen things that were unthinkable under the Cold War scenario, Operation Spiderweb attacking part of the nuclear triad of Russia, the Zaporizhia power plant constantly being under attack. Today, again, Russia Today published an article of a second worker who works in the Zaporizhia power plant who's been assassinated off duty, and these kind of pinprick escalations. Last week, a large monument in Sevastopol that was being blown up, zero military value, all a lot of cultural value to the Russians. What's your assessment of this situation?
Well, I think it's an extremely dangerous situation. It's dangerous because it can lead to an escalation that could become very difficult to control and ultimately results in direct warfare between the United States and Russia, which would,
Devastating.
yeah, it could go nuclear and it would be absolutely devastating. So this is not something that we should take lightly. Now, on the Russia side, the problem is that President Putin, I think, wants an end to this war. It's very clear that the Russians are uh, very strongly, for largely geopolitical reasons, wanting a compromise that will allow them to argue that they've achieved the objectives of the special military operation, but in reality, they're going to have to compromise on some things that really matter on to the Ukrainian side of this and to their Western partners. The biggest one is to say we're not going to get in the way of Ukraine's accession to the European Union. Now, that was an issue that back in 2014, after the Maidan Revolution, the Russians absolutely opposed. And Maidan had its origins in the EU accession agreement that the Russians felt would uh, force Ukraine into the Western camp and cut off Ukrainian ties to Russia. So this was an issue that the Russians cared very deeply about then. And today, I think they are saying they're not going to stand in the way, which is, I think, a huge concession.
On the other hand, though, I mean, if I believe to remember that it was NATO membership that was the core, the core of the objection. That EU membership was actually something that for the longest time Russia said, as long as the EU remains an economic community, then they have little problems with that. And actually, as you correctly point out, I mean, Vladimir Putin recently just again said that he's not against the NATO joining the EU, although a lot of Ukraine joining the EU, the red line, the absolute red line over which they're going to war at the moment is NATO.
Right. That's right.
So,
but there are two aspects to this. Back in 2014, Russia assumed that EU membership was the precursor to NATO membership. So they were worried about the slippery slope. But the other part of this was, Foreign Minister Lavrov just published on the Foreign Ministry website an article that he had tried to publish in Politico Europe, which was ultimately rejected by the editors there. But in that, he does go over this history of the EU accession, the association agreement in
Yeah.
2014, and the provision within it that Ukraine would have to end any possibility of involvement in the Russian free trade zone.
Yes.
And it was that choice that Brussels forced upon Ukraine. You know, you can either have an association agreement with the EU or you can be part of the Eurasian Economic Zone, but not both.
Which is actually something that the Russians didn't do. They said, like, you can be part of our economic zone, and we don't care what you do with the Europeans.
The Russians said you can have both. Brussels said no, you can't. And that became a very big source of friction in 2014. And since that time, Russia's position has evolved. They have understood that EU membership does not necessarily lead to NATO membership. And they have said, you know, if you close the door on NATO being in Ukraine or Ukraine being in NATO, then we can live with the EU membership eventually. Now, to me, that is a compromise. It's a fairly significant geopolitical compromise. It enables a scenario like the Austrian State Treaty,
Mhm.
where you have a country that is militarily neutral, but is a member of the EU and has deep links to European trade and economic practices, et cetera, et cetera.
It took me a while, it took me quite a while to understand why it is that this military neutrality of Ukraine didn't not only not become a thing, but why it went into reverse gear. Because the Ukrainians had an article in their constitution before 2014 that said they would strive for neutrality. That was then replaced by the current version, which is they would strive for NATO membership. And we know that in April 2022, the linchpin of the Istanbul Accords were basically the neutrality of Ukraine. That was the main thing, and that was sabotaged, and it was sabotaged by Western powers. And we even have now a lot of people on record, including Victoria Nuland, who in an interview once said, you know, that kind of agreement would have neutered Ukraine, and wouldn't have been a good thing. Why is it that from these quarters, the neoconservative quarters of the West, a neutral Ukraine, a bridge between the two worlds, is so impossible? And why is it that these people have so much sway over U.S. politics?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is that um, with the end of the Cold War, America decided that its foreign policy ought to be about turning that Western bloc, you know, that NATO organization that came out of the Cold War, into a model for the entire global order.
But without Russia, without Russia in it. So,
Well, we were actually happy to have Russia in it as a subordinate,
right,
not a full member. You know,
right.
you can't join NATO. That would, you know, change what NATO is. But you're welcome to be a part of the Western community as some sort of junior subordinate. You can have a seat in the NATO Russia Council. And what that will allow us to do is explain to you after NATO takes decisions, here's the decision that we've taken. Now, you can't change that decision, but you can at least sit there in the room and hear about the decision that we took. Now, you know, the Russians looked at this and said, wait a minute, you know, this doesn't seem like a very attractive model for us.
Yeah, and the West now seems surprised that that doesn't look like an attractive model because, funnily enough, I mean, within NATO, the Germans and the others have kind of accepted that that's the model. When they're informed by the decision makers in the United States what's going to happen, they have a very hard time actually saying no to that.
Yeah, no, that's right. Um, which is a whole separate conversation in and of itself. But, that mindset that we, you know, should be in a unipolar world,
Mm.
and the community that the United States helped to form and lead during the Cold War, which then, you know, covered a significant part of the world, but not all of it. You know, we led the free world, but then there were vast portions of the world that weren't included in that. Um, we then came into the unipolar era with the demise of the Soviet Union and said, let's take that free world and expand its borders to include everyone. And if you tell the Russians, no, Ukraine can be neutral. It can be neither ours, nor yours. It can be neutral, somewhere in the middle. You have essentially said our ambition, our vision for what the world ought to look like isn't viable. We're abandoning it. We're coming up with something else. And we weren't willing to do that. And today we're in a different reality. We've got China, we've got rising middle powers. The world isn't unipolar anymore, and the question is, how multipolar is it going to be? That's a different world, and I think from that flow different imperatives for U.S. foreign policy.
Like this kind of attitude of neutral ain't good enough is probably not going to work anymore in this multipolar world. So, which would make me believe that there must be a change in the attitude also within these policy circles in the United States, but I don't see them yet. Or do you see them like forming that more kind of realist attitude toward we must find some sort of compromise also on our side?
Right. Well, I think you're seeing the beginnings of that recognition in the United States. It is not a majority position, but it is no longer a marginal position. I think there is a growing minority that is arguing increasingly effectively that the world has changed and we're going to have to take a different approach to the world. We can't pretend we're the unipolar power anymore.
Mm.
So we're going to have a more realist approach to the world, drawing upon balance of power principles and diplomacy to supplement deterrence and coercion, and to work in partnership with coercive elements of policy, and recognize that we can't afford to unite our enemies, unite our adversaries, and encourage them to work against the United States, which in fact we have done. I think a lot of the approach that we adopted during the unipolar period incentivized counterbalancing and hedging, and the formation of partnerships against the United States to counterbalance our power and influence. And so we're going to have to take a different approach to be effective in the new environment.
So in a sense, at some point in the maybe not too distant future, it should kind of sink in also in Washington that if you don't want others to counterbalance and hedge, so basically gang up together, you better foster kind of neutral places that don't do that, while maintaining a balance. So you kind of underwrite my thesis that we're going to see more neutrality again, like pop up naturally from here.
We should. I think it's in America's interest to
Mm.
allow that as a possibility, as the global order evolves.
That's a very good point. It's actually a positive note, and I would love to end on that because most of my talks don't. They are like down in doom and gloom. So I'm happy we didn't go there. George, people who want to follow you and your work, I mean, I suppose they should go to the Quincy Institute, or where should they find you?
Yes, the Quincy Institute homepage is at Quincy Inst dot org. I have a Twitter handle. I think it's GBB13, something like that. So those that want to follow me there are welcome.
I'll make sure to Google it and find the handle, and also put the homepage of the Quincy Institute into the description box below. Everybody, please follow George Beebe there. George, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.